Today, I'm proud to announce the release of a new China Commission report detailing how global supply chains are tainted with goods and products made with forced labor in Xinjiang.
The document that should leave zero doubt about the evil policies of the Communist Party of China towards Uyghurs, towards other Muslim minority groups.
This is an historic bill. I do believe it'll pass. I hope it'll become law.
Over the past several years, the Chinese government created and expanded a system of extrajudicial mass internment camps. As many as 1.8 million Uyghurs and members of other Muslim groups, including Kazakhs, Hui, and Kyrgyz, have been arbitrarily detained in the camps and subjected to forced labor, torture, political indoctrination, and other severe human rights abuses. With the coronavirus outbreak, Uyghurs and other Muslim communities are even more vulnerable. There is great fear about the risk of disease spreading within the mass internment camps, where people are forced to live in close quarters under tremendous stress and health issues. This situation raises serious humanitarian concerns and is another reason why the repression of the Uyghurs and other Muslim minority groups violates international rights standards.
Anything that's produced in this region is done so through forced labor. This, by the way, these practices of the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang is one of the world's largest human rights tragedies. It remains unimaginable, frankly, that this is happening in the year 2020, where you have hundreds of thousands of people subjected to military discipline, to so-called re-education, or what we know as political re-education and indoctrination. We have families that are being separated, children being placed in orphanages and boarding schools, the elderly forced into nursing homes, people forced to change their names and abandon their identities. And commercial satellite imagery shows that factories have and are being placed next or to or right inside these camps. And there's also mounting evidence of forced labor in the cotton industry, in agriculture, and other light manufacturing. The widespread forced labor documented in the report clearly constitutes serious crimes sanctioned, perpetrated, approved, and directed by the Chinese Communist Party through their government. The Commission, in fact, noted in our annual report that what is taking place there probably rises to the level of a crime against humanity. We're not the only ones. As was mentioned previously, the Holocaust Museum just last week concluded that what the Chinese government is doing to Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities is a crime against humanity. Words, however, are not enough, and we must act and respond quickly to these horrific crimes being committed by the Chinese Communist Party, and this bill, I believe, does that. And we hope that other countries will join in working on similar legislation to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party and the people responsible for this are collectively and individually held accountable, because this crisis will demand an international response. And I will predict that history will not look favorably on those who knew about it and did nothing and stayed silent, or even worse, were complicit in these crimes.
The most important part of this bill, recognizing that these are crimes against humanity being committed against the Muslim Uyghurs, this is a horrific tragedy, as both the chairman and the Senate chairman pointed out. The Holocaust Museum has called these crimes against humanity. It is clear these are horrific crimes. The rebuttable presumption is the core to this important piece of legislation.
Chinese authorities would certainly much rather have swept it under the rug. Nothing is more dear and more sacred to us here in America than the concept of freedom. We have fought for our own freedom, and we've gone to war to ensure the freedom of others around the world. We have marched, we have rallied, we have protested, we have boycotted, and now we need to stand up for those who are enslaved in China. Time and time again, we've stood up to dictators and tyrants who have threatened freedom. We cannot sit on our hands and do nothing, as China has repeatedly and systematically abused the human rights of the Uyghurs and other ethnically Muslim minorities. For years, we have seen hundreds of thousands, even millions of individuals interned tortured, interrogated, and brutally forced into labor camps by the Chinese government, stripping individuals of their freedom, their future, and their culture. And as we know from this latest report, this isn't an issue that is improving. In fact, it's getting worse. This system of slavery is expanding. The internment camps are expanding. Between April 2017 and August of 2018, satellite imagery shows 39 re-education camps have tripled in size. Without knowing it, Americans all across our country have a connection to these human rights abuses through the products we buy. Products, including popular name brands, have been made or in whole part by Xinjiang province. And no matter how much they try to make sure that forced labor is not part of the supply chain, the access to information, the lack of transparency makes it impossible to be sure. Just look at cotton. China is one of the world's largest producers. 80% of it comes from this region. How much of that cotton is picked by Uyghurs and oppressed minorities? There's no real way of knowing. Until we can know, and until we can do due diligence and ensure that supply lanes are not in fact comprised of enslaved workers, and until we can ensure the freedom and liberty of oppressed minorities in China, we should do everything possible to ensure that our nation and the American people are not complicit participants in the abuse of their human rights.
I represent a district in Northern Virginia that includes one of the largest populations of Uyghur Muslims in the United States. I heard story after story of the horrors that their friends and families in Xinjiang had been subjected to, how they had been disappeared from their homes and placed in re-education camps, how they had in many instances been forced to renounce their faith and to eat pork or drink alcohol. And then once their re-education was complete, how they were forced to labor as a part of a work training program. This despite the fact that many of those who were disappeared were physicians, professors, and other professionals. And how the fruits of their forced labor have turned up in so many products here in the United States, in the clothes that we're wearing, in the shoes that we're wearing, in the food and tea that we eat and drink, and in the electronics that we use every day. This rebuttable presumption, I cannot overstate how important that rebuttable presumption is going to be in terms of disclosures and everything else. Now, as a member of the House Financial Services Committee, the disclosure part of it is very important to me as well, because I believe that once U.S. companies, shareholders, and consumers are aware of the horrors that are going on in Xinjiang and beyond, that they won't want to be participants in that system. So this is fantastic legislation.
Most Americans don't realize what's actually transpiring right now in China. It's horrific. Whether it's asking the Uyghur Muslims to eat pork or making Uyghur Muslims eat pork during Ramadan. Forced labor in Xinjiang, this is happening right now as we speak, and people are suffering because of it. And this bill, which I'm so happy to be an original co-sponsor of, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, is so important because it's the only thing that the Chinese government will recognize is if we prevent them from continuing to export these goods using forced labor into our marketplace.
The Chinese government's brutal campaign of repression in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, including widespread forced labor, has been exposed in grim detail through first-hand refugee testimony and the Chinese government's own documents. Forced labor is integral to the government's strategy to establish social control and cultural dominance through force over the Uyghur people and other Turkic and Muslim groups. While the government's clampdown on information has made documentation at specific workplaces a daunting task, we know, both from the specific documented cases and from the vast scope of the government's program of forced labor as social control, that the risk is broad. that virtually any workplace in the XUAR, whether a cotton farm, a yarn spinning mill, or other industrial work site, is a potential locus of forced labor. Given the substantial risk of forced labor at any farm or factory, and the absence of credible due diligence methods, the only option for brands and retailers that want to comply with U.S. law and their own ethical standards is to exit the XUAR at every level of the supply chain. While heavy dependence on Chinese cotton, yarn, and fabric make exit a cumbersome proposition, this cannot justify complicity in what the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has deemed crimes against humanity, nor can it excuse breaches of U.S. law. No apparel brand wants to be associated with the abuses taking place in Xinjiang. Bearing in mind that it won't happen overnight, brands and retailers must work with urgency to remove XUAR-produced content from their supply chains and to sever ties with Chinese companies implicated in forced labor. This is a goal they should accomplish in months, not years. Stronger action from the U.S. government to block imports from the XUAR is also crucial. Thank you.
As the world has learned about the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and particularly against the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, the connection to global supply chains, including evidence of forced labor, is really clear. In the context of forced labor in Xinjiang or in other parts of China, Uyghurs are not able to speak up or speak out on their own behalf. That means that companies cannot engage with them in the detection or remediation of forced labor, which raises the risk not only for workers but also for companies.
Xinjiang Autonomous Uyghur Region of China is home to over 13 million Uyghur and other Turkic and Muslim peoples. The human rights situation related to the XUAR is a very serious concern for the global labor movement. The state-sponsored internment and forced labor of a population because of their ethnic or religious beliefs is unconscionable and has been widely condemned by unions worldwide. The global labor movement hopes and expects that the U.S. take action using these and other tools at its disposal and to encourage other major importers of goods from the XUAR, including the European Union, to take similar action. U.S. brands must, of course, also accept their responsibility to extricate themselves immediately from the XUAR, and by ensuring that none of their suppliers are using inputs linked to the government-sponsored re-education program. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak about China's genocide and the world's largest government-directed human trafficking forced labor network. What's happening to Uyghurs and the other Turkic people is common knowledge by now. The Uyghur ethnic identities are stigmatized and the religion is demonized. Racism and cutting-edge technology are used as a weapon of Chinese nationalism to exterminate my people while challenging the human dignity and the basic survival rights. My sister, Gulshan Abbas, a retired medical doctor, is one of these victims. She was abducted by the Chinese government on September 2018 in retaliation for my speaking out about China's human rights abuses in East Turkestan at the Hudson Institute. China has allowed no contact with her since her disappeared and has not even provided a proof of life and her whereabouts. China claims that these sprawling camps are humane vocational job training centers. This is a lie. Detainees include medical doctors, academics, business people, professionals, as well as young children and the elderly, none of whom need job training. Well-researched reporting indicates these camps serve to break people's spirit and turn them into an abundant supply of forced labor. So my question is this: who is the buyer of my sister's forced labor? Gap, LL Bean, or H&M? Is my sister in one of your contractors' factories? Are you complicit in China turning a doctor into a textile worker as a forced laborer in your factories? Nike is one of your largest factories in China using my sisters-in-law as a part of its Uyghur forced labor from Hotan. One of them is a nurse and the other is a teacher. Were they transformed by the camps into modern-day slaves to produce your shoes? Or did you prefer younger Uyghur women forced to work thousands of miles from home so they would not bear children while they were housewives, like my third missing sister-in-law. When my sister was taken by China, I had no idea finding her again would involve finding out US companies are so shockingly complicit in such disappearances. 75 years ago, companies like Siemens, BMW, and the Volkswagen used forced Jewish labor, and now, once again, complicit in their suppliers' use of forced Uyghur labor, making today's concentration camps a profitable venture. But this time, the rest of the world's top companies have joined in such a complicity. US law requires global Magnitsky sanctions on individual offenders and prohibits any trade in production and products made with forced labor. So who's preventing the enforcement of law? Has Xi Jinping been granted veto power over US laws? Exactly what part of never again translates into not to sanction the Chinese perpetrators of today's concentration camps and to separate them from their enablers. It saddens me to see the venal ruthlessness of the reality of the world communities as they are idle against this genocide of my people. Not only China's getting away with genocide, but getting rewarded with hosting Winter Olympic 2022. It angers me to see my sister and the other millions of innocent Uyghurs becoming human collaterals of international trade deals and the economic benefits. It worries me to see China become a power able to strong-arm the world with trade threats, the power of the Belt and Road Initiative, debt trap diplomacy, and the manipulation in United Nations. Furthermore, China is bribing and leveraging some politicians, the media, the scholars around the world, and has successfully silenced international condemnation of its shameful crimes. What do you think is going to happen if this remains unchecked? Continuing to do business as normal with China today is being complicit with genocide and supporting the spread of China's totalitarian communistic nationalism to the world. History will remember those who act and those who fail to do so. We are all responsible for what happens next. Thank you.